Welcome to another deep dive into Unsolved Cases by Skoob. I'm your host, Larry Hunter, and today we're traveling to the heart of rural Texas in 1984, to a small town called Flatonia, where a young mother's life ended in circumstances so shocking, so suspicious, that her family has been fighting for truth for 40 years. But before we dive into the darkness, let me tell you about Rowena Wilkinson Zapalac. Not as a victim, not as a headline, but as the vibrant young woman she was. Born on October 7, 1963, Rowena grew up in the kind of close-knit community where everyone knew your name and your business. She was just months away from her 21st birthday when her life was cut short in September 1984. Those who knew her remember a completely different person than the one described in police reports. Her sister Joleta, who was only 15 when tragedy struck, described Rowena as a talented rodeo rider, a kind, fun person, and a mom, just trying to figure out how to give her son a good life. This wasn't some troubled soul living on society's margins. This was a beloved daughter, sister, and devoted mother to her young son Brandon. Rowena had married her high school sweetheart Thomas when they were both very young. Thomas came from a prominent local family. His father sat on the town bank's board and wielded considerable influence in Flatonia. Their love story was typical of many small-town couples. Young love, an unexpected pregnancy while still in school, and the decision to build a life together. In interviews years later, Thomas spoke of Rowena with genuine affection, describing her as thoughtful and caring. Someone completely incapable of the reckless behavior authorities would later claim led to her death. After her separation from Thomas, Rowena found independence in a small studio apartment above a saddle shop in downtown Flatonia. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. Her neighbor and close friend, Ruby Cherry, lived in the same building, and together they created a small but supportive social circle. Rowena's manager, Jessica, remembered her as steady and reliable, the kind of employee you could count on. Family remained central to everything Rowena did. Her parents maintained strong bonds with all their children, and Joleta looked out for her younger sister with fierce devotion. This wasn't a woman spiraling out of control or exhibiting self-destructive behavior. This was someone building a life, working hard to provide for her son, and surrounded by people who genuinely cared about her well-being. The night before she died, Rowena went out with Ruby and their group of friends to the local stag club. Nothing unusual, just another evening of socializing in a town where entertainment options were limited. Ruby later remembered it as completely ordinary, with nothing that would suggest the horror that awaited just hours later. Rowena was last seen returning to her apartment around 4 a.m., walking through the quiet streets of Flatonia for the final time. When Rowena didn't show up for work the next day, concern began to ripple through her small circle. This wasn't like her. She was reliable, responsible, especially when it came to work that helped support her son. Someone went to check on her at the studio apartment above the saddle shop, and what they found would haunt this small Texas town for decades to come. The scene that greeted investigators on that September day in 1984 was shocking, but not in the way you might expect. Yes, they found Rowena dead, with a rope around her neck connected to the bed frame. Yes, there was a sex toy on the bed. But what happened next defied all logic and proper investigative procedure. The Fayette County Sheriff's Office made a decision that would reverberate through the decades. They ruled Rowena's death an accident, specifically what they crudely termed suicide by masturbation. Their reasoning? No sign of forced entry, and the presence of the rope and sex toy. Case closed. Literally, they opened and closed the investigation on the same day. But here's where this story takes a turn that will make your blood boil. The day after Rowena's body was removed, her 15-year-old sister Joleta and their father went to clean out her apartment. What they found was a crime scene that told a completely different story than the one police had already decided upon. Picture this: pennies scattered across the entire floor. Not dropped, not fallen from a purse, but scattered, as if knocked over during a violent struggle. A broken kitchen window with glass on the floor. So much for no forced entry. Water still standing in the shower stall more than 24 hours after Rowena's death, suggesting someone had used it recently and left in a hurry. But the most damning piece of evidence was what Joleta found near the heavy coffee table Rowena used to block her door because it didn't lock properly. A broken acrylic fingernail with blood on it. Joleta, despite being just 15 and in shock, recognized its importance and handed it directly to an investigator at the scene. Years later, when Joleta finally obtained the official case files, that bloody fingernail was nowhere to be found. It had never been logged into evidence. A fundamental breakdown of investigative procedure that isn't just oversight, it's obstruction. How do you forget to document physical evidence that could contain DNA from an attacker? The official toxicology report would later reveal another contradiction in the police narrative. While investigators pointed to an empty liquor bottle and burnt marijuana cigarette as evidence of Rowena's alleged reckless behavior, her blood showed relatively low alcohol levels and absolutely no marijuana. Those items had been placed there by someone else, or used by someone else who was in that room with her. What the sheriff's office didn't emphasize in their rush to close the case were the findings from Rowena's autopsy. Details that, when examined closely, paint a picture of violence, not accident. Dr. Roberto Bayardo conducted the autopsy, and his findings included several details that should have raised red flags. Rowena's fourth right fingernail was missing entirely, consistent with someone fighting desperately to free themselves from an attacker's grip. There were scratches on her neck and symmetrical bruises on her arms that suggested she had been held from behind. The sheets and pillowcases were stained with blood, diluted blood spots that suggested cleanup attempts, and, most significantly, semen and hairs that did not belong to Rowena. Let me repeat that. There was biological evidence of another person at the scene, and yet investigators maintained she had been alone. This is where the context of 1980s small-town Texas becomes crucial. We're talking about a time and place where certain types of deaths were considered shameful, where families were often told to accept official explanations quietly to avoid embarrassment. Joleta later admitted that her family initially didn't want to stir the pot because her past may embarrass the family and her 3-year-old son. But the medical evidence told a story that couldn't be silenced forever. The positioning of injuries, the presence of foreign biological material, the signs of struggle throughout the apartment. None of it supported the theory of accidental death during solo sexual activity. Dr. Bayardo's report noted all of these inconsistencies, yet somehow they were buried beneath the official ruling. Years later, researchers would discover that Dr. Bayardo had a troubling history of questionable autopsy rulings in other high-profile cases, adding another layer of doubt to his conclusions about Rowena. Here's where Rowena's story becomes even more chilling. She wasn't the only young woman to die under suspicious circumstances in Flatonia during that period. Just 6 months before Rowena's death, 26-year-old Melody Ann Bush vanished and was later found dead. Like Rowena, Melody had been last seen at the Stag Club, the same local bar where both women spent their final evenings. The difference? Melody's death was immediately ruled a homicide. She had died from acute acetone poisoning, a method so unusual it suggested someone with specific knowledge of chemicals. Yet when Rowena died under equally suspicious circumstances just months later in the same small town, authorities rushed to rule it an accident. 2 young women, same town, same bar, deaths 6 months apart, but completely different investigative approaches. The pattern raises disturbing questions about why one case received serious attention while the other was dismissed almost immediately. This discrepancy becomes even more significant when you consider that Flatonia is not a large city, where multiple unexplained deaths might go unnoticed. This is a small Texas town where everyone knows everyone, where two suspicious deaths in 6 months should have set off alarm bells throughout the law enforcement community. Nearly 20 years after Rowena's death, the case took an unexpected turn when letters began arriving from a Colorado prison. Robert Charles Browne, a convicted murderer serving life for killing a teenage girl, started claiming responsibility for dozens of murders across the United States. Browne was born in 1952 and lived the drifting life typical of many serial killers, moving state to state, working short-term jobs, and leaving a trail of destruction. While only officially convicted for one murder, he began writing elaborate letters to law enforcement agencies, journalists, and investigators, claiming he had killed 40 to 50 people over several decades. His letters were theatrical and attention-seeking, filled with poetic language, hand-drawn maps, and cryptic clues. In one chilling message, he taunted authorities. "The score is you 1, the other team 48. His map marked 7 claimed victims in Texas alone. But it was a specific letter from March 2003 that caught investigators' attention. Browne wrote about a very small town that seemed to be my best bet, Flatonia, Texas. The year was approximately 1984 or 1985. A young woman was killed, and her body was found near this town. A year later, he sent another note with just 3 words that made investigators' blood run cold. Flatonia/ether/ice pick. Browne described his methods in detail, meeting women in bars, following them home, using chemicals to incapacitate them, then killing them. His description of opportunistic hunting matched the vulnerability of both Rowena and Melody, both of whom lived alone and were last seen at the same local bar. Investigator Charlie Hess, who interviewed Browne extensively, described him as someone who treated his confessions like negotiations, trading murder details for prison privileges. While Browne's claims couldn't all be verified, he was known to exaggerate and insert himself into famous cases for attention. His specific knowledge of Flatonia and the timeline was disturbing. After her parents died, Joleta Wilkinson embarked on a decades-long quest for justice that would consume her life. She requested the complete case files from the Fayette County Sheriff's Office and was stunned by what she discovered, or rather, what was missing. Key evidence she remembered from that traumatic day cleaning out Rowena's apartment was nowhere to be found in official records. The bloody fingernail had vanished. The broken window was barely mentioned. The water in the shower, the scattered pennies, the signs of struggle, all absent from the official narrative. Joleta began writing letters, speaking with investigators, and building public support for reopening her sister's case. She started a petition asking authorities to change Rowena's death certificate from suicide to homicide, arguing that proper classification would allow for modern DNA testing and database searches that weren't available in 1984. The petition meticulously outlined evidence that had been ignored: injuries consistent with restraint, signs of staging at the scene, foreign biological material, and physical evidence of struggle. These factors disprove the notion that she died by accident, the petition stated, demanding that the case receive the thorough investigation it never got. Modern forensic techniques could potentially identify the source of the semen and hair found at the scene. DNA databases that didn't exist in 1984 might provide matches. Advances in forensic pathology could offer new interpretations of Rowena's injuries. But all of this requires reclassifying her death from suicide to homicide, something that would admission that the original investigation was fundamentally flawed. What makes Rowena's case so disturbing isn't just the possibility that a killer walked free. It's the systematic failure of institutions that were supposed to protect her, even in death. The sheriff's office closed the case within hours, refusing to consider alternative theories, despite obvious evidence of another person's presence. The medical examiner noted injuries and biological evidence consistent with homicide, but allowed his findings to be buried beneath a predetermined conclusion. Evidence disappeared. Files were incomplete. A 15-year-old girl had to collect crucial physical evidence because trained investigators ignored it. The toxicology report contradicted the scene staging, but no one bothered to investigate the discrepancy. This wasn't just negligence. It was a complete breakdown of the justice system in a small Texas town where certain narratives were more convenient than others. Was it easier to label Rowena's death a shameful accident than to admit a killer might be hunting young women in Flatonia? Were there connections between the perpetrator and local power structures that made a real investigation uncomfortable? The speed with which the case was closed, the missing evidence, the contradictory findings that were ignored, all of it points to an investigation that was designed to fail from the beginning. 40 years after Rowena Wilkinson Zapalac's death, the truth still refuses to stay buried. What was once reduced to a rushed police report now stands exposed as a case filled with unanswered questions, ignored evidence, and a justice system that chose convenience over accountability. Rowena was not an accident. The signs of struggle, the missing evidence, and the contradictions all point to a story far darker than the one officially recorded. And thanks to her sister, Joleta's relentless fight, that story is finally being forced back into the light. But here's the question that won't go away. If this wasn't an accident, then who benefited from closing the case so quickly? And what else was overlooked? The full story, the hidden connections, and the evidence that could change everything are waiting. Download the Skoob app now to get access to the complete investigation and hear what was left out of the official record. Because the dead can't speak for themselves, and sometimes justice depends on who refuses to stop listening.